This Climate Week NYC, we invited the public to tell us their climate story. Here's what they had to say.
The whole world just evolves and exists because of nature.
A love of nature.
The beauty and the embrace of these wild spaces.
I would say that's what really got me interested in climate work to begin with.
We live in a moment where it feels that more and more people are conscious about the climate crisis. They're suffering it in their body, in their health.
Increasingly, our summers are hotter, our heat waves are more frequent, and they're longer in duration.
I mean, I have friends who left Southeast Asia because their kids can't play outside. It's just so hot. The air quality is atrocious.
The biggest way that we're seeing climate change roll out is in water events.
We moved to LA, and we were really close to the Eaton fire just this past January.
Countries like the Philippines, water accessibility is challenging.
I know that we have family members and other people in our communities who are getting sick.
The water temperature itself has been rising.
The crisis of climate anxiety that we have, not just in youth, but throughout our entire society. People are feeling hopeless and isolated.
It's a grief or loss of a future that we don't get to have.
I mean, that is the reason I'm in therapy right now.
By acting, we don't feel anxious, we feel part of something.
I think just the constant practice of doing helps you not be overwhelmed.
We do actually have actionable things that we could do that could make the city cooler.
I hug trees.
I educate my son and peers close to me.
The more people we bring into the fold, the more we make people see themselves within this movement, combats this loneliness, this fear, this anxiety, because we're stronger together.
Bring community members together.
Community.
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 Bring communities together.
It's not what if we get it right, it's we will get it right. It's just a question of time and a question of shifting our mindset.
This Climate Week NYC, we invite.
Hello, and welcome to the Power of Storytelling, a New York Climate Exchange webinar on transforming climate communications for impact. My name is Helene Hetrick, and I'm the Director of Communications at the New York Climate Exchange. Thank you so much for joining us for one of our final events of 2025 for us to dive into this very important topic. Today, we are joined by thought leaders across journalism, research, climate tech, equity, and public engagement to discuss the state of climate communications and to better understand the important role of storytelling. We also want to be here to exchange ideas for how we can make this work more accessible to more and more people. In short, climate change needs storytelling, so let's make it happen. For those of you who are new to the New York Climate Exchange, we are a nonprofit that is designed to accelerate climate solutions here in New York City and beyond. Our consortium is made up of 48 partners, which are anchored by Stony Brook University and spans academia, the corporate sector, and civic and local organizations. This powerful group of partners is dedicated to breaking down the silos that we see so often in climate work. Hopefully, you've seen that we are building a climate campus on Governor's Island, as you can see in this picture on the screen. This will be a state-of-the-art mass timber building, which will feature a research center, an education building, and convening space for unprecedented collaboration and to really supercharge the climate solutions that are already existing and that are still to be. Without further ado, I'd love to introduce the speakers for today. First, you'll hear from Melissa Joan Rowley, who is a climate and gender equity justice advocate, a columnist for Rolling Stone and other publications, director of communications at Reverb, and founder of the Climate Mic Drop Summit, which some of you may have attended during Climate Week this year. She's also the author of an upcoming book, Beyond the Mic Drop, How Our Stories Shift Culture, Power, and Policy. So very much looking forward to hearing from Melissa. Before you take over, I'm going to also introduce Jamil Wyne, who will dive into some really interesting insights on climate communications that he's developed with our Climate Tech Fellowship program. So he is the founder of the Hazelwood Network, which develops new programs, initiatives, and ecosystems to support climate innovation around the world. And then after that, you'll hear from my colleague Aja Two-Crows, who is our Community Initiatives Associate, and she's going to tell you a little bit about the Climate Story Project, which you just heard as you were entering the webinar. And then Shaina Horowitz, our Director of Program Innovation and Acceleration at the Exchange, will guide us through a Q&A session. So as you're listening, feel free to drop questions into the Q&A, and we will address them in about 30 to 35 minutes when our speakers have finished. So pass it over to you, Melissa.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. And I'm having so much fun reading everybody's hellos and comments. And I want to talk to all of you. There's the program manager at the Moth, the Redford Center, friends of mine, someone from Stony Brook. So really excited to connect with all of you. And thank you to the New York Climate Exchange for having me. As Helene mentioned, I wear many hats in the climate movement. I started my career as a journalist many moons ago, about 20 years ago, as a producer for CNN Business News. And then I moved over to entertainment, which was very fun, but I lost my soul doing that when things got really gossip oriented. And then I got into technology, which ultimately led to me working in social impact and climate. I started meeting a lot of founders and incredible innovators that were harnessing technology for good. And this was back when the term tech for good was a thing. I don't really think it is popular anymore because so much of technology is harnessed for benefiting for humanity. At least we hope so. The last few years, my work has really been primarily focused on climate because I learned just from traveling to more than 70 countries and writing about entrepreneurs in conflict regions and war zones and meeting so many brilliant people in really obscure corners of the world that climate touches every aspect of our lives. And if I'm going to continue working in social impact, then climate should really be at the forefront of that. So I'm going to take you through a few different areas of my work. One will just be 5 key practices that I try to conduct when I'm either writing or speaking about climate to audiences or just having an everyday conversation with someone, whether it's about climate, justice, economics, politics, whatever it may be that's top of mind and really topical right now. And then I'm going to take you all through some key insights and ideas that were shared during the Climate Mic Drop Summit, which Helene mentioned. The Climate Mic Drop Summit is an independent event series that just started. We've only done one, so I guess it's not quite a series yet, but we held our inaugural summit in New York during Climate Week. We featured about 65 speakers in 8 hours, which was great. I'll probably never try to pack that much in again in one day, but it was a big learning experience. And many of our speakers were activists on the front lines of justice. We mixed in some climate tech and some climate finance, because I often find that when I'm at a conference that's focused on justice, that those tech and finances pieces seem to be missing. And when I'm at climate conferences that are focused on technology or finance, the justice element isn't front and center. One of the greatest takeaways I can share before I get into my slides and my presentation, just overall about what I've seen at big global climate convenings, which many of you have probably attended and witnessed, is we could be so much more powerful as a movement if we weren't so siloed. I wrote this in my book, actually, which I'll talk about later, maybe if I have time, shameless plug. When I was sitting in Dubai in the hot beating sun in Expo City for COP28 2 years ago, couldn't find my way around, and I just sat on a lawn chair and I was taking in the scene around me, and I saw these incredible indigenous elders walking by with their indigenous wear and their feathers, and they were so stately. And I saw some global diplomats walking by. I saw people from the World Bank. I saw people from corporations that were touting carbon markets. I saw the climate tech bros in the climate tech innovation alley, and then VCs, and then I saw ocean warriors and youth activists. And it's a really beautiful, marvelous thing to see. But just amongst ourselves as a movement, there's a lot that we need to become more integrated on. And I think there can be a lot more solidarity in just the movement overall because it is so diverse. So that's one of my main focuses and something that I want to invite people to join myself and other people that are working on this in, because the stronger we are as a community, as a movement, that's when we're really going to start to penetrate the mainstream media and mainstream storytelling with real impact and real emotion that moves the needle. So I'll start getting into some of my main practices, if you will. We can move to the next slide. Actually, the next slide is just a pretty, there we go. Yeah, you can show that one. It's cute. This one is, there you go. Now let's go to the next one. I just wanted to show it. So the main thing that I find when I'm talking or writing about climate is that we're in this place, I think, particularly from a mainstream media perspective, and more niche media outlets are doing this as well. And they're also doing great storytelling that hits home with personal stories. But so much of what I see when I'm scrolling through my feed is response to climate denial or response to environmental rollbacks, which we're seeing left and right now in our country, response to legislation that doesn't work for us, response to more and more threats and more disasters happening, whether it's extreme weather, natural disasters, or financial, right? But simply responding and reacting is not going to get us to where we're going to go. It's not going to move people to join the movement. You know, it's relatable to respond because the social media algorithm is wired to engage us in optimism and outrage. The more we engage in this, the happier the algorithm gets. But then our personal stories and insights get lost in all of that. You know, there's no nuance in outrage, and sometimes even in just pure optimism. And I'm an optimist I would like to consider myself one. But when everything is so black and white, we lose the humanity, we lose the story, we lose the ability to connect with people that are living and seeing things differently than us. So my first point is to invite everybody to focus more on being a main character, having that main character energy, instead of just being the fact police. I'm sure many of you have been in debates, either online or in person, where you're having a conversation and someone says X and you say, no, it's actually Y. And here's a link. Here's a fact to back that up. Here's the thing. We can't fact check people into submission. Nor should we want to. We should want to open the dialogue for curiosity and lean into it more, because that's really the root of all great storytelling. It's curiosity. But what happens is when we're talking with someone who is either in denial of climate or in denial of pollution or in denial of the fact that the climate crisis is a health crisis, the climate crisis is a migration crisis, the climate crisis is becoming more and more of a financial crisis, the more and more people don't see that. And then if we try to pressure them into seeing that with links, the more and more they often hold on to their inaccurate stance even stronger. It's something called the backfire effect, which I can read you the definition, and some of you might be familiar with it. But basically, it's a cognitive bias where people, when shown evidence that contradicts their deeply held beliefs, they reject the evidence even more strongly. And like I said, hold on to their stance. And because people don't shift when information in front of them changes. People shift when their internal story changes. You know, they shift when the person they see themselves as, or when they see where they belong, and when they see a future that could be different with themselves in it. They shift when their position in a broader context changes. And that's not necessarily fact driven. We need facts. I'm going to get into that in a second. But if we continue just leading with data, like so many headlines do, if we continue just leading with 1.5, no one but us knows what that means, right? Nobody but climate scientists and people in our movement knows what that means. If we continue leading with statements like net zero and how do we reach this, we're just not going to get anywhere. We're going to keep talking to ourselves and our very convenient, comfortable echo chamber. And it's nice in there. It's cozy. It makes us feel good about ourselves, but it's not getting the movement anywhere outside of that. So again, people shift when their internal story changes, not when facts around them change. Second point I want to make is that I think it's possible to make justice feel inevitable rather than just theoretical. We often talk about justice in the framework of using the word should. We should be doing this. We should be more diverse and inclusive. We should be talking to frontline communities more. We should be more focused on X, Y, and Z rather than just the numbers. We should be able to have regulations around AI data centers. We should be able to do these things. But should is one of the least motivating words in the English language. No one wants to be shoulded, right? So humans respond to momentum, to movement, to the feeling that something is already in motion, to a train that's going someplace beautiful that they can jump on and be a part of something massive. Effective climate communication speaks from a place of motion and highlighting what's already working, what's scaling, and what communities are building now. And there are so many incredible local solutions happening now. It's very easy, as I'm sure many people will relate to feeling overwhelmed, to feeling distrust to the information around us, to feeling cognitive dissonance. I just saw that term in the chat, to feeling hopeless, to feeling angry. I've definitely felt all those things over the years, and in particular, since January. Taking to my Substacks and just writing everything out and ranting has been one of my only saving grace. Being the storyteller that I am, putting it out into the world has been one of my only saving graces. And what's really, I think, the solution is, in so many ways, is local stories. There was an event that I went to during New York Climate Week last year. There was someone from the Biden administration. This was when Biden was still in office, and we were talking about the Inflation Reduction Act. And the reporter on stage said, "Well, that it's great that the Inflation Reduction Act has done so much and created 300,000 jobs, but at the same time, the United States is at record high levels of producing oil and gas. So don't you think that's contradictory to this legislation?" And this particular person in the government, he has a job to do. He has a position. I think it was a very difficult question for him to answer, given his position, not given that the question itself was difficult. The answer was very simple. Yes, of course, it's a contradiction. There are many contradictions within politics, within the climate movement, within many industries and sectors, within so much of what we do. Everyday people, we're all walking contradictions in some regard, right? But the last thing you want to see is at a Climate Week event is hearing such a stark contradiction. And so after seeing that, and then after going to a number of events, I felt really disenchanted 2 years ago. I was convinced that everything is just one giant offset. And I was starting to question what I was even doing. What are we all doing? We're just moving backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. And while progress is not linear, it still was putting me in a very dark place of despair until I went to Oaxaca, and I visited a friend who started a nonprofit called Cosa Buena. And she took me into the mountains to meet a woman who's been a mushroom forager for 30 years, maybe. And she made everything. She made me food, and she showed me how she was foraging mushrooms and her livelihood. And then my friend took me down to a school, an indigenous school in the Zapotec villages, very small, I think maybe 15 students. And they started their own green pharmacy to basically rescue the ancestral knowledge of their elders. And they created a green pharmacy and business model around it. They created their own recycling system and water catchment system. Very small, very simple. And, but seeing these local solutions and being able to be witness to that story changed everything. I was suddenly back in my faith in the climate movement, and I was back on the train again. So it's that movement, it's that motion, it's people already in action, is allowing people to see those stories. Because when they feel like they're joining something active and growing, they're far more likely to stay engaged. Third point, rather than staying on the defense, we can set a new frame. When we spend all of our energy responding to misconceptions or unproductive storylines, it's very easy to go into a slippery slope and accidentally just keep repeating them and adding more fuel to them. So instead, what I prescribe is starting with the world we're actually trying to build. Starting with what stability can look like, what stability in some places is already looking like, like these local solutions I was just mentioning, what resilience feels like in practice, what healthier and community-centered systems can enable. When people can picture a future clearly, they stop arguing about the past. Isn't that beautiful? This is also where hope becomes a strategy, not just a mood. Hope becomes a strategy and a guiding direction. And I'm going to talk more a little bit about hope in a second. And I want to touch on policy a little bit. I know I just kind of criticized the Inflation Reduction Act, or not so much criticize the Inflation Reduction Act, but kind of the counterproductive things that we were doing alongside it last year. So while nothing is perfect, most policies aren't perfect. They are actually what moves the needle to a scaling point for societies, right? And there are so many policies that seem completely crazy or impossible until they actually happen. And then one day we wake up and say, actually, it's been this way for so long. I couldn't imagine a world where women couldn't vote. I couldn't imagine a world where segregation was law, right? And so all these things that have made America better and made America more diverse and inclusive actually were thought to be crazy at one point. And I think the same thing can happen with the climate movement. We're at a very challenging, dark time when it comes to a lot of this, but there's still innovation happening, right? In classrooms and in conversations like this, and in local communities, like I said before. I also wanted to touch on something that happened in the 70s and 80s it was California's Clean Air Act. So this happened when California required catalytic converters to curb smog. Automakers said it was technologically impossible and that it would ruin the economy. And the same was said when California pushed for low emissions and zero emission vehicles. But today, catalytic converters are a global standard part of the equipment, and California's ZEV policies have shaped the EV market worldwide. So I wanted to just touch on that because policy, I think, sometimes is viewed as just a collective action, but it's policy is collective, but policy is also personal, and our personal stories, when we bring them all together to shape a larger narrative, can really make a difference. Fourth point I want to talk about is the importance of elevating unexpected messengers. Right. So there are a lot of climate influencers and thought leaders that are well known, and there's more and more coming to the forefront every day, which is beautiful to see. But what about the unexpected messenger, the people that we wouldn't think would be a climate messenger? The farmer living in a red Republican state who just wants to adapt his farming abilities and the planting cycle. A fisherman noticing changes in the water long before any kind of satellite confirms it. A youth leader organizing peers around air quality, or a neighborhood elder watching generations unfold. And at one point, maybe feeling like, oh, I don't need to contribute anymore. I'm on my way out of this world. But then actually taking their knowledge and applying it to all the idealism and energy that young activists have, right? These are unexpected messengers. I'll give you another example. So the environmental nonprofit that I work for, called Reverb, is the leading partner in making the music industry more sustainable. We do this a few different ways. We mobilize musicians and millions of fans to take collective action. We amplify support and provide resources for environmental and social justice nonprofits. And we power major festival stages with hybrid and clean battery power. We recently powered the main stage at Lollapalooza over the summer. And we also powered an entire festival called Healing Appalachia, which was headlined by Chris Stapleton and Tyler Childers. I don't know if there are any country music fans out there, but it took place on a former coal mine site in the middle of coal country in Kentucky, which is a very red region. And some people might think, oh, well, the people there won't be interested in investing in clean energy. It couldn't be further from the truth. When we talked to the organizers of this festival, Healing Appalachia is focused primarily on recovery for opiate addiction, but their message was very clear. In addition to healing the people, they very much wanted to heal the land. So that was all a part of this larger mission in working with Reverb. My fifth and final point that I want to go over is giving people a role they actually want to play. So in addition to us being the main character, instead of being on the defense and just attacking people with facts, giving people that we want to have join us an actual, real, tangible role to play. If the narrative that we share with people sounds like everything is fire and it's all our fault, or it's all their fault, or just becomes a blame game, people emotionally become overwhelmed or check out, or they fan the flames, which we don't need any of that right now. There's enough flames being fanned. But if the narrative sounds like you matter, your voice matters because you have an environmental or climate story, everyone does. Share yours. What is it? Here's where you fit. Here's where you fit in the larger narrative. Here's how your contribution makes a real difference. People lean in when they hear those words and then when they get that invitation. You know, agency is contagious. A person having agency is a beautiful feeling. It's one of the most gorgeous feelings I think a person can have, having that autonomy and having the boldness to say what's on their mind and what they want for their community. You know, that's what drives sustainability forward. So climate communication works best when people can intuitively answer the question, what is my role and where am I? Who am I in this story? That's when participation becomes identity and not just obligation. One other thing I want to touch on, I totally lied, there's one more thing, is the importance of wonder. Some of you might have been involved with or seen the theme for World Oceans Day this year. It was, it's also celebrated as Ocean Week, but the whole theme was wonder. And I just think there's a missed opportunity when we're talking about the planet and we're talking about saving it and protecting who and what we love. There is some content being created around that for sure. There's some amazing things happening with music and sound and films and documentaries. But the dominant themes that I see in mainstream media and on my LinkedIn across colleagues of mine is here's the facts, here's why they suck, here's why this sucks, and blame and blame and blame. And so we should focus on the solution and only the solution and fund the solution and not anything else, right? Rather than when we could be focusing on wonder and the marvel of the world and how spectacular it is and inviting people to be a part of that larger story and how magnificent and cinematic it is. How am I doing on time? I think I've talked a little bit longer. So I would want to get into climate mic drop. But if no one's going to give me a time cue, we can just move on.
You've got about 3 minutes, unfortunately.
Okay. All right. I know I talked way too long on these, but
no, it's great. It's great.
Okay. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
So we can skip this side. Let's go to the next one. Okay. So I think I can get through at least 3 of these. All right. So major themes that came up at the Climate Mic Drop Summit in September during New York Climate Week. Narrative equity, right? Narrative equity basically is making sure that everyone has a voice, that we pass the mic to everyone, especially frontline communities. I can't stress it enough. If we're not going to have justice at the forefront of our climate storytelling, it's basically greenwashing, in my opinion. So something that Chad Frischman, a friend of mine who wrote Drawdown, he created the architecture for Project Drawdown. He's now the founder of an organization called Regeneration Intelligence. He was saying how institutions are stories themselves and we can rewrite them. So basically, what I take that to mean is that, you know, when he says that institutions are stories we tell ourselves and agree, if we created them, we can recreate them. He's naming something essential about climate communication. Every story we move through, political, economic, cultural, began as a story someone convinced enough people to believe. And narrative strategy works the same way. A story becomes a narrative when enough people repeat it, uphold it, and organize around it. That's how stories harden into norms. That's how systems take shape. And that's exactly why climate communication is so urgent right now, because we're living inside these inherited stories that none of us asked for, most of us don't like, and they're about energy, risk, responsibility, and possibility that no longer match the reality we're facing. So when we tell a different story, one grounded in justice, imagination, and lived experience, we start to shift the feelings available and the feelings that can be accessed. And once belief starts to shift, behavior follows, policies follow, and institutions follow suit. That's really the bridge. Stories to shared narratives, to cultural norms, to institutional change. One more point really quickly, I'm going to end on this so that we can go into the next presentation, but no more trauma narratives. I know trauma leads the headlines and that gets people's attention and it sparks outrage, but it's not effective for creating a movement that's sustainable and that people actually want to be a part of. Sharon Foster, who was a speaker at the events, she said, we're so focused on trauma. She brought up the New Orleans disaster from 20 years ago. It was its anniversary this year. She really emphasized the focus of the seeds of renewal, because those stories were happening and are still happening in New Orleans as well. But we get very little coverage and very little support around that. Emily Janik from CARE said, we are not victims. She heard this from an Indigenous person who's a part of the CARE program. Tell the story about our strength and the future we're creating. And Reverend Yearwood Lennox Jr., who is the president of Hip Hop Caucus, This stood out to me a lot. I put this in several videos. If we ever stop talking about what we need to phase out and focus on what we must phase in, this movement will be successful. And I think that pretty much encapsulates all the other points that I was making earlier. So I will stop there. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And I'm excited to answer any questions after all this.
Thank you so much, Melissa. We're going to head over to speak with Jamil. Really appreciate your presentation.
Thank you so much, Elaine, and the Climate Exchange team, and also Melissa. Phenomenal presentation. Excited to continue this conversation offline, hopefully. Let me go ahead and share my screen, and if the Exchange team could just give me the thumbs up to make sure that they can see it okay. And then let me switch over to my full screen. Is everybody able to see that all right?
Yep. Yes, looks great.
All right, excellent. So I believe I've got about 15 minutes. I've got my timer over here, but feel free also to keep me on track if I go off the rails at any point. So as a quick preview of what I want to cover, so my company, the Hazelwood Network, has partnered with a really fantastic foundation called Radius Foundation to develop both kind of a new body of research, but then a new initiative surrounding climate communications. And so we're about halfway through that project right now. And so what you're going to see today is a snapshot of what we've learned so far. This is primarily a research product. So it's focusing on kind of insights that we've gleaned from speaking to about 50 to 60 different climate communications and storytelling experts, primarily focusing on the US, but we did have a little bit of a global lens. With that being said, most of what you're going to see today is domestic in concentration, meaning that it reflects the current dialogue in the US around climate change, the communications efforts that are trying to reverse that or evolve it, as well as our own recommendations for what we think a step in the right direction when it comes to making climate communications and storytelling more impactful needs to look like. So with no pun intended, let me just first start with what the quote climate around climate change looks like in the US, and meaning kind of what are we saying right now when it comes to climate change by and large, kind of who's saying it, and also what are we not saying, and then from there I'm going to move into a little bit more granular overview of what climate communications as a unit or as an industry, so to speak, is doing about it. So first headline I want to introduce here is that engagement and dialogue around climate change, even though I think, as Melissa rightfully said, is chock full of challenges, areas for improvement, reasons to be discouraged, on the whole is improving. And it can be hard to keep that in focus. But if you look at things like Yale's climate communications teams, Six Americas, which you see on the right here, as well as just general belief in the US around global warming, you can see we are going on an upward trend, right? More people are taking it seriously. People are talking about it. People are moving from being disengaged and doubtful to being alarmed and concerned. And even though, as Melissa very rightfully said too, that can sometimes discourage action, at a minimum, people are taking it more and more seriously, right? So I just want to introduce this as the kind of the starting point for the conversation, that we are, I think, moving from an era where denial, disengagement, discouragement, et cetera, was the norm to at least, and I know this sounds like we're setting a very low threshold here, to at least acknowledging the severity of what's happening, right? But I think that means we're also moving it into an era, which we'll see here, where we don't actually prioritize it, right? And it might sound like a little bit of a nuance or a subtle difference, right, between taking it seriously and prioritizing it, but there is a difference, right? You can see here on the right that when it came to the 2024 elections, at least when we looked at exit polls, climate change was not absent from the list of priority areas, but it was nowhere near the top, right? And for those of us that work on climate full time, we can see overlap, right, between immigration and health, economic policy and jobs, and climate change. So to say that it's divorced entirely from these issues is inaccurate. But people don't necessarily prioritize it still, real. And another way of thinking about it is climate change really a dinner table topic, right? Our families talking about it, right? Of course, we talk about it in the news and journals, and obviously in really important spaces like this that we have here today. But is it really making it into the dialogue and conversation of our peer groups, right? Of our families, households, et cetera? that are not built, right, to tackle climate change, right? That's not what they're mandated to do. And the answer would be it's rare, right? Doesn't mean that people don't believe in it, right? Doesn't mean that people don't think of it as an important issue, but it may not be on people's minds, right? Which I know is a little bit of a kind of a strange phenomenon, right? How can it be on your mind, but you're not taking it seriously at the same time, right? And vice versa. And so that's an important nuance, I think, to capture here. That's something that we learned in the work that we were doing earlier this year. And let's think a little bit about why that could be the case, right? So one of them, and you can see this in the top right, if you recall a few years ago during the heat waves in Texas that had just debilitating impact, not just on kind of farmland and water resources, but just our general ability to go outside, right? Which is going to become the norm more and more. Extreme heat is often the way that most people in the world, that in water scarcity or too much water in some cases, are going to experience climate change. Only 5% of the national headlines that talked about these heat waves were able to actually draw a point of correlation between what was happening and climate change, right? So it didn't mean that the news outlets were actively denying it, but they were not actually discussing it. And so that basically what would happen is we would report on this phenomenon, which is, for those of us that work on this, a very clear example that climate change is real and a threat, but they wouldn't make the connection back to climate change, right? And then you can see below too, that in media scripts and news scripts, climate change doesn't also actively factor in, right? Perhaps in some cases that's because reporters and journalists are actively told not to talk about it. But I think we also need to leave room for the fact that a lot of people still don't draw a connection between the science, as Melissa was talking about, and what our day-to-day reality is, right? Attribution around climate change is still very, very difficult, right? You and I could go out and we could burn a bunch of tires in the road. We would not feel the effects of that in terms of temperature. We could also dramatically increase the amount of direct air carbon capture, and the temperature would not change either, right? And so attribution in a very complicated system like the one we live in can be very challenging. And I think that's one reason why it's been very difficult to get people to the point of understanding not just that this is an issue to be taken seriously, but to make it a top priority in how they vote and how they lead their lives on a daily basis. The other thing is, obviously, we're living in a very politicized environment. I don't have to tell you that. It's not uncommon here to hear kind of backlashes purely based upon principle rather than, we can make we've already made a very strong business case, for instance, for renewable energy, electrified mobility, and it's becoming politicized, right? And that's just a sliver of the larger climate tech tech solution set. And so point being, we're still in an environment, sadly, where just by virtue of working on climate and sustainability, it can become politicized, which I think decreases the amount of attention and also obviously seriousness that it receives in our daily lives. And then we obviously are dealing with a lot of misinformation. We also, I think, struggle still to figure out who are the correct messengers and audiences to talk about or talk to and talk with when it comes to communicating, and which I'll dive into in a little bit there. And so I think we also are dealing with the fact that there's a lot of spending that goes into misinformation and kind of misalignment around climate change that those of us that work on this space have yet to really crack. And I'll talk about that in a little bit in the upcoming slides. And so let's now transition into what does this mean for the state of climate communications and storytelling writ large, right? Something to keep in mind is that as a discipline, climate communications is still quite young. I mean, those of us that drink the Kool-Aid and think about this are kind of, I would think, don't necessarily consider this to be a nascent field. It's just part and parcel of what we do on a daily basis. But when it comes to a discipline, right, and building out our capacity to tell a story based on data and science in a way that resonates with a wide range of different audiences to do an even wider range of things, we're still, I think, in the early days of that. And that became very clear in our research. But as a starting point, we put this diagram together to map out who we think are some of the more active players in this space. Again, it's primarily US. And you'll see here a mixture of groups that by definition are mandated to work on climate storytelling and communications, right? And a lot of these are in the bottom left. So entire organizations like Probable Futures, Solutions Project, Potential Energy, et cetera, very, very heavily focused on storytelling and comms at the core. But then you obviously have a lot of players in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors outside of this that aren't necessarily built to do that, but in some shape or form, they do it anyway, right? Environmental Defense Fund is a great example of that. A lot of work is done in coalition building, outreach to communities. You have groups like Ogilvy, which obviously isn't built necessarily around climate change, but the way that they communicate and what they do to help their clients understand and communicate around sustainability is kind of part and parcel of what they do as within their business model. So point being here is that when we look at the strengths of climate communications is that one is that, as you see here on the left, there is a community of practice, right? There are institutions that are being built. A lot of these are young institutions, so we're not looking at like a decades old industry by any means, but there has been a lot of movement and a lot of smart people working on it. We also have some very important frameworks, right? And I know that sounds a little bit academic, but look at things like the Yale Six Americas, which is all actively used by different groups to kind of frame the ways in which people's attitudes toward climate are changing. It's a really important framework, right? And I think it's something that we take for granted. So there are different tools, different types of campaigns, and different strategies for talking about climate that have emerged that are getting kind of institutionalized in our industry. We also see a nice balance of macro and micro outreach, right? So we have large institutions that try to tell the story at a national level, but obviously, as Melissa is talking about as well, we really are, we need to do more of this, but we also do see some groups doing it. A group like the Solutions Project in particular does a great job of this, of working with frontline communities. And so this balance of grass tops and grassroots, or macro and micro, is something that I think this field is understanding and starting to champion more and more. And I know this fourth bit doesn't necessarily sound like a strength in the ecosystem, but I do think it is important. When we did our research, and like I said, we talked to close to 60 different experts in this space, there was widespread agreement that the narrative we often tell is wrong around climate for many reasons. And I'll go into that in the next slide. I think kind of why the field is still struggling, or what we think some of the struggles look like. But there is widespread recognition that something needs to change, which sometimes, if you're a glass half empty person, you might say, well, obviously that is a problem. Why are we celebrating it? The glass half full part of me would say, well, we need to be able to recognize that there is a challenge first before we can start solving it, right? And so I don't think we would be holding this session today and bringing such a diverse group of voices together if we all didn't agree in some shape or form that we need to be making some very, very tangible improvements and fast. Last, I would say, is that there's this growing belief that we need to be using tools in a much more savvy way, right? We have a plethora of AI and digital tools that are emerging. Those are often being used to spread disinformation, to build coalitions against us. But here we can actually start using these tools, and we'll talk a little bit more later in the presentation about how some groups are doing that. Now let's move on to the challenges, of which there are many. I know this is a heavy slide. I'm not going to go into too much detail on each one of these, but there's a wide range of ways in which, when we think about what needs to change, we can different areas we could be prioritizing. So one is that it's a highly underfunded and not very well recognized field, right? For those of us that are in it, that might sound a little bit counterintuitive, because we have so many amazing people working on it, great funders that are participating in it as well. But when you think about it, climate communications and storytelling is not necessarily, say, something vis-a-vis renewable energy, not necessarily a big moneymaker when it comes to climate action and climate movement writ large. So there's not a wide range of different funding sources that can easily come into it. It's largely philanthropy. And then philanthropy is being asked to do everything from produce new climate science research to fund climate communications. And so finding that large and growing body of funders to back it is a challenge. One also is, I won't go into this too much detail because Melissa already rightly touched on it, but just it's a fragmented field, right? We have our little fiefdoms, little groups that work with each other very closely. But as I showed you a few slides ago, it's a big field. And for us to really galvanize action, we probably need to be putting a lot more diverse coalitions together. I would also say that stories often tend to be stuck at 10,000 feet, right? To elaborate a little bit on what Melissa said, I think we say 1.5 degrees centigrade, but the biggest polluter in the world historically uses Fahrenheit. The second biggest polluter in the world, being China, is probably not actively thinking about 1.5 degrees centigrade, because we often talk in English, right? Which I think is something that gets lost in conversation too, that we often talk from a US angle about climate change. Most of the world doesn't think from that angle. So the science doesn't make sense, the language may not make sense. And we also have difficulty just attaching that back to our individual identities and what we do on a daily basis. And so stories being stuck at 10,000 feet, both in terms of the language we use and the perspective that we use, is still something that we saw a lot in our research. And I think this is to the last point in the bottom right, you know, it's still seen, I think, as a field that kind of wealthier organizations and individuals work in. Most of the world does not belong to that community, right? And so again, to go back to what Melissa was saying, being able to reach across the aisle and work with different communities that have virtually nothing in common with us is going to be, I think, one of the critical determinants of success here. When it comes to funding, and I mentioned this just a second ago, but this is just to illuminate what the lack of funding looks like, right? So climate philanthropy, if you think of that as the main financial tool to be funding communications and storytelling efforts, that is only a sliver of overall climate finance, less than 1%, right? 9 billion might sound like a lot, but when we think about the trillions needed in general to fund climate solutions globally, that number is going to have to go up significantly if we're going to factor in a more healthy portion of it going into climate communications. And so we're dealing with a very underfunded field. And then when we talk about what the playbook has typically looked like, it's often rigid. It doesn't necessarily have key messengers built into it, right? Not all of us respond the same way to different messengers and messages. And so we have to kind of fight the urge to build this one-size-fits-all approach to communicating climate change if we're trying to get on board a really wide range of different audiences that have very, very different life experiences than us. And so one thing that I'll add before going into what some of the solutions are looking like, something that came up often in our research, which isn't really here. Unfortunately, I didn't put it in there because of time, but I want to add it in anyway, is that the field, I think, still lacks a North Star. It's very difficult for when we would sit down with different experts in this space and ask them point blank, how do they determine success? We would always receive a different answer, right? If you're sitting down with somebody, for instance, that is working at a maybe political level, their goal in climate communications and storytelling is maybe to get climate to be a top 3 item agenda on every senator's kind of list of priority areas, right? That can look very different, though, if your audience is Wall Street and you're trying to get banks to factor in climate risk into the wealth management portfolios of their clients, right? That can look very different if you're working with scientists and trying to teach them how to communicate their research more effectively to investors, funders, entrepreneurs, and technologists that can convert that research into a company, right? So we are still at this point where when we're thinking about what we want to do with climate communications and storytelling is still kind of up for grabs. Now, what I want to close on is a few things. One is, if we were to start building a new kind of advanced toolkit, how would we want to do that? Then I want to talk briefly about who could be tasked with being the messenger there, and also what would they say, right? And this is, again, me kind of committing some of the crimes that I said we've been committing by trying to be too big tent, too top down, but I want to give it a shot and show you guys a little bit of what we thought about and what we learned as we went through this exercise. So one is that it was really hard for us to find examples of groups that are really using behavioral science techniques and putting them to use in not just educating people on climate change, but then galvanizing action as a result. There's a whole field of propaganda, persuasion, different ways that people use to, in marketing, for instance, to convince people to buy a product, right? To adopt a certain political point of view. It was really difficult for us to find groups that are actively thinking about what these tactics are. And so I think there's a huge room, a lot of white space opportunity here to be thinking about how do we leverage, age-old behavioral science principles that can be converted into very tactical moves to help people not just understand an issue, but to get them to start taking action around it. And then when it comes to who some of these people are, we need to appreciate the fact that we all often respond differently to different types of messengers, right? You can see here, if you're a moderate to conservative Democrat, you will probably have higher level of trust in climate scientists. However, if you're a conservative Republican, you're probably going to have a higher level of trust in family and friends, as well as your primary care doctor, right? It doesn't mean that as a result, nobody trusts NASA or scientists, for instance. But as I said earlier, there's a difference between taking something seriously and making it a top priority, right? And so I think we see something very similar here when it comes to messengers. And the last thing I'll add on is then what if we are to identify those messengers, what should they be talking about, right? Most people are not particularly interested, I think, in 1.5 degrees, right? Or actually digging into the science of climate itself. There's only really, I think, a small subset of the global population that is really legitimately interested in that. I've been working in the space for a while. I've never read an entire IPCC report, right? I'm not dying for the next piece of literature to come out of, Berkeley, Rice University, et cetera, on this stuff. Most of us, and this is something that came across too, and there are some groups that are prioritizing this, are thinking about, well, freedom, fairness, health, wealth, and security, right? It's hard to find, different common denominators that bring us together as humans, both in the US and outside of it. This is something that one particular group, I don't want to put their name out there just in case they want to remain anonymous, has prioritized in their work, and it's effective. Using these types of tactics, using these types of messages can be a very, very instrumental to just meeting people where they are, right? Because that ultimately, we're all looking for ways to lead safe, healthy, productive lives, raise families, get jobs, et cetera. Letting the science, the finance, often in my field, we use financial terms often to talk about climate change. Letting that get in the way of that, I think actually kind of stymies the effort of communicating climate change effectively. And so embedding this in the way that we talk to people not only helps to meet them where they are, but I think it helps to build alliances and move towards action much more effectively. I will end there. I hope I've stayed within the 15 minutes, but I'm obviously happy to answer any questions later in the Q&A if people would want to go deeper on any of this. And thank you.
Thanks so much, Jamil. Wonderful presentation. I'm really excited now to share a bit more about the Climate Story Project. I'm just going to bring it up on my screen. All right. Hello. My name is Aja Two Crows, and I'm a Community Initiatives Associate at the New York Climate Exchange. I want to say a huge thank you to Jamil and Melissa. They've luckily covered a bunch of what's already in this presentation, so we're just going to be building on it. I'm here today to talk about the Climate Story Project, which I've had the real delight of working on with Shaina Horowitz, our Director of Programming, Innovation, and Acceleration. This is an audio story project where we have invited folks to tell us about their experience of climate change and really, as our other presenters have talked about, to build out this sense of what a climate story can be. And before I get into the nitty-gritty, I think it's much better to just have you guys listen to an episode so you can get a sense of what I mean. So we're going to start with our first episode over here from our Climate Week pop-up. This is an episode that was recorded by David Ohana, a participant at our in-person pop-up recording booth at Pioneer Works in Red Hook, Brooklyn. This story was produced and sound designed by Kylie Miller. This is the Climate Story Project, where we share real stories about how climate change is shaping our lives. Stories that connect us, stories that move us to act. This is a project of the New York Climate Exchange, a nonprofit organization that's accelerating climate solutions through our unique partnership model and climate campus on Governor's Island. This Climate Week NYC, we invited the public to tell us their climate story. The story you're about to hear is from David Ohana, a participant at our Pioneer Works pop-up. Here's what David had to say.
I have a lot of family that is based in Iowa, and a lot of them are farmers. But I was born and raised in New York. And so when I was a kid, I would travel there in the summertime, spending a little time working on a farm, which for a city kid was always novel and fun and taxing. It worked exactly as my mom had intended it to work, which was to ideally get me focused and build a little bit of grit. When you're out in the middle of Iowa, there are all these cricks, as they call them. That's how you pronounce it. Just you go down to the crick, So you get in a four-wheeler, and we just zoomed across the farm where we knew where there was a little crick at, and we're just roughhousing. I think I fell into the crick at one point, and then my cousin Chaz came to rescue me, and then I was like, screw that. I just pulled him in right there with me. And beneath my feet is just this really weird mush. very impossible texture to describe, kind of like sinking dirt that kind of clings to your toes. Very weird feeling. We're taking this stuff up and we're just throwing it at each other like it's the grossest thing in the world. And I'm like 12, right? And so for me, it's just a hot summer. We're just trying to cool off. But as we make it back to the family farm, my mom, she's kind of yelling at me like, where'd you go? And I tell her, it was like, oh, we had fun, we did this, we did that, and then we went to the creek. And then she stops, she's like, what are you talking about? I go, oh no, we went down to the creek, it was a great time, you know? She's like, both of you guys are soaked. Like, oh yeah, we swam, we threw things around, it was a great time. Mom just immediately stops right there. The whole family stops doing what they're doing, just looking at us. Mom brings me over and takes out a hose and is just like, you have no idea. All of the runoff from all of the farms just collects into this little area and just runs down. So it was just totally polluted, and also hormones from all of the different livestock that was around, and fertilizer runoff, PFAs that, you know, seeped into the water. So I mean, we're getting this thing in our mouths. But yeah, my parents hosed me off, and and to this day, it's just like this very weird experience of just having like the most fun, just like embracing nature as you are as a kid, going from nature to gross disgust very quickly. There's just so much pollution in all of the waterways around Iowa. It's becoming increasingly an issue in Nebraska. And now when I went back just this past summer, and I'm with all of my family who are farmers, and my grandfather died of cancer, and I hear more stories of other family members, you know, second cousins, aunts, who all have a story of someone, either themselves or someone that they know, getting cancer. And, you know, when I was there, I was surprised to see the kind of fervor around people's water purifiers and bottled water, and kind of some skepticism of like swimming in the local lakes a little bit. And I don't really think that I had any sense of that when I was a kid. But to learn this thing and then be like, great, well, now I want to talk to my cousins and my family members who are farmers about it and be like, what's their take on it? And it was like, it was omerta. I mean, you could not talk about this with them at all, because any idea even that could threaten or disrupt the farming practices or just the farming culture of Iowa was almost a non-starter. And yet they all are able to acknowledge it. But I was surprised at how they could immediately understand an issue, and how that then had all of these downstream consequences, though, of being like, well, let's not look into that issue, though, too deeply. Because if we do, we then maybe have to confront some really harsh realities around it. I want to drink water, so I'm going to keep drinking water. I'm not going to think too hard about the water. I don't want my grandma to experience a kind of anxiety when she turns on the tap, which she did consistently. I know that we have family members and other people in our communities who are getting sick, but we don't have enough science to be able to say that it's exactly these practices, right? Even though, you know, you have a University of Iowa that conduct these studies to say these things are really not good. And it's tough to know that your family is at risk precisely because of the things that they do every day. To worry about our cousins having shorter lives. There's a very weird trade-off of the sort of competition to be a great farmer, to provide for your family, and for that to be in tension with the well-being and lifespans and health spans of your family. That, to me, is a kind of bargain that no one should ever have to make. They love their farm. They love nature. They talk about the beauty and the embrace of these wild spaces around them, which are less and less wild. And so I believe in a kind of prosperity for that place and for my family. I think that they deserve that. And they really do, at the end of the day, knowing them, despite our differing views on so many things, I do know that they also want that. I think it's possible.
This story is part of the Climate Story Project. To find more stories and learn more about the New York Climate Exchange, visit nyclimateexchange.org and follow us on LinkedIn and Instagram. This episode was produced by Kylie Miller. Thanks for listening. All right. Thank you so much for listening to our episode. This was an incredible story from David Ohana, produced and sound designed by our incredible producer, Kylie Miller. And, as we've said throughout, as we've said throughout this presentation, and as you've heard, clearly and importantly, the climate crisis is here. So many of us are feeling it in our communities, in our bodies, and in reading literally anything on the internet. But in addition, we know that motivation and inspiration can't just be motivated by facts and science alone. And especially, as Melissa had shared, we can't motivate it only through talking about crisis. It's so critical to have these conversations and to lean into storytelling, because I believe Melissa said this as well, it creates agency. This is something that we were talking about before with health and wealth and the things that motivate us to act. And so in building the Climate Story Project, we were really reflecting on some key principles of the New York Climate Exchange itself. At the Exchange, a huge part of our work is really thinking about how to break silos between academia, government, community, business, and really thinking about novel approaches to climate work and climate action. And critically, this project is born from the notion that storytelling is an incredible tool for climate action. Not only does it create a sense of agency, it creates a sense of catharsis for those telling the story and those listening to it, when we can recognize our fears and our dreams and our hopes in other people and feel connection there. In general, this is something that's so critical as we also build a movement to show people that they're a part of this movement. This is a conversation that has often been mystifying and a bit prohibitive for people. And so really bringing in people means putting them in the driver's seat of their own story. And that's what we did with the Climate Story Project. Our first season was really rooted in the connection between human health and the climate. Now, health is such a great place for us to start, because health is something we all feel, we all recognize it in our bodies. But when we start getting expansive and thinking about what health really is, health isn't just our physicality, it's the health of our family, of our community, and of our planet. And in these stories, when we talked about the connection between human health, there's also always emergent the incredible desire that people have to get healthier. They want their bodies to be healthier. They want their communities to be healthier. And people want to do actions that support that. They want to take action and not only think about how we're going to be healthier now, but how we're going to build a healthier future. I think our other presenters really well articulated that this movement isn't just about confronting the moment we're in, but in building a future that works for everyone and that is safe for our planet. And so in thinking about, the whole plan here was not only to create this audio archive, but to invite the public to record with us, which is something we did at Climate Week. That's where David's story came from. But in questioning, as we're building the project, what would it motivate people to tell a story? We realized that one of the most motivating things as a storyteller is to hear other people's stories. And so what we built was a community of storytellers. At the Exchange, we have an incredible subset of community partners from across the city. And we built this network of storytellers who would be able to offer us a sense of the varied and diverse amount of stories out there. And so this group of people was 13 individuals ranging from teens in high school to elders, frontline activists. They represented 13 different organizations and all 5 boroughs of New York City. I want to zoom in a little bit to tell you a bit about who these people are. So I'm going to share a bit about these 2 folks. First is Elizabeth Blaney on the left. She's a septuagenarian from Queens. She's lived there her whole life, and she's a member of the Southeast Queens Resident Environmental Justice Coalition. Elizabeth has lived in Queens, as I said, forever. She remembers when the summers were hot and the winters were snowy, and she also has noticed the change over her life. And the most profound way she's seen this in her community is with the rise of groundwater flooding, an issue that is so prevalent in New York and so many cities around the world. Flooding is such an issue of climate, not only because flooding can be devastating, but because its recurrent nature, the way it's been happening more frequently, can be harder and harder to deal with. And in Elizabeth's community, that became very clear when members of her community started getting West Nile virus. When we think about Queens and diseases we might get in New York, we're usually not thinking of West Nile virus. But in her community, this continued to happen because of groundwater flooding that created stagnant pools of water where mosquito-borne illnesses were thriving. Now, Elizabeth, with her coalition, partnered up with the American Geophysical Union, a partner of the exchange, and specifically the AGU's Thriving Earth Exchange, which is an incredible group that brings together scientists who are focused on community science with community members to initiate projects in their community that help them better understand and advocate for themselves. And what they did in Southeast Queens was do a study that showed the effects of this groundwater flooding, that demonstrated the real effects on health. And this is something that Elizabeth did that not only provided for her community by advocating for them, but provided nourishment to herself. She felt an extreme sense of agency in being able to advocate for her community, in being able to take a community that she has lived in her whole life and support it in the way she best could. Now, on the right, I want to tell you a bit about Mahayat. Mahayat May Noor, they are a youth climate journalist and editorial intern at Solar One, a partner of the exchange. Solar One focuses on teaching about renewables and generally is really engaged in elevating the voice of youth. Mahayat grew up in Bangladesh and immigrated in middle school. They note in their story the really stark differences they felt between Bangladesh and then New York in the way that so many global South communities experience elevated rates of climate impacts. And yet, when they came to New York, they were still blown away to see the amount of climate impacts here, the way that the climate conversation is clearly unequal, but also is so prevalent everywhere. And they were so motivated to act that they've now been a youth climate journalist for about 4 years, reporting on and learning more about the way that climate is affecting their community at home in Bangladesh and here in New York City. And really, what these stories show is these myriad of emergent story themes that we saw across our work. Of course, there are things like concern and loss, there's existential anxiety, but throughout all of our stories, we saw an incredible thread of hope, of dreams of recovery. So many people mentioned their memories of a healthier climate. It was important to them. It was something that they realized was critical to save, and that built resilience. So many people finding community in crisis and taking action to adapt and recover. At our Climate Week event, we hosted 2 pop-ups, both one at the American Museum of Natural History in Manhattan and one in Red Hook, Brooklyn. We were so excited to see a ton of engagement with this project. We've had over 78,000 views on social media, and at our in-person conversations, we had over 300 visitors and recorded 26 impromptu stories. Building this digital archive, we took those 26 stories and produced 6 full episodes from Climate Week, which are now available across all of our platforms. The first story you heard, David's, is one of those 6. I want to close by just saying that throughout all these presentations, you really see the way that storytelling can be motivating, it can be cathartic, and it inspires people to keep going, not only to take action, but to continue to take action and make it a practice in their own lives. And we're just so thankful to all of our storytellers who you can see on the right here, who contributed stories that show the myriad of experiences. You can find our stories on the Exchange website, and they're also on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to all of our presenters. That was a whirlwind, and I know we just have a few minutes left together. So I want to invite you back on screen and we'll get through at least, I think, one round of questions together. I'd love to hear sort of a version of this from each of you, maybe beginning with you, Melissa. You touched on this a little bit, but what's your advice for people feeling overpowered, overwhelmed by just the sheer magnitude of climate change? I love this idea that you introduced of practice and participation as antidotes to that, or the sense that we really do need to model the future that we want to build and want to see. What has that looked like for you? What would you encourage others to think about?
Yeah, well, I think to answer that, I'll share a quick story. There was an immersive experience that I participated in Sacramento, and then it moved to Rio for COP. It was basically 3 domes put together. And before we went into the domes, they asked us to fill out a survey about how we're feeling about the future. So it had numerous questions. How do you feel about the future of technology and AI and climate in the world, the current events? And as I answered the questions, so this was back in, I think, May or June, I stepped outside of my body and thought, wow, I feel really terrible about the future. It was the first time I actually saw that about myself, because I never thought of myself as being a pessimist in any way. I went through the domes. We took us through this meditative experience, imagining the future. And then we actually started to do some world building with, we had different technologies where we could build the ideal future led by indigenous knowledge, the ideal future that's just all about harmony between oceans and space, the ideal future, whatever we wanted to build. And then it would produce pictures of it. After I walked out of there, I didn't feel completely brand new or like I'd done a 360, but I definitely felt more hopeful because I had tapped into my imagination. When we're constantly consuming content, it's really hard to use your imagination. In fact, I don't even know that it's possible when you're just taking in, especially the content that we're inundated with on a daily basis. So I would say get offline for sure. Imagine what the ideal world would be for you, whether that's your own home, your own backyard, your own community, your city, your country, what it looks like, what it feels like, what conversations people are having, what inventions are being created, what the air quality is, what it looks like. Imagination, and also researching and really exploring, again, the local solutions that are happening probably closer than you might think.
Yeah, I love that. Aja, maybe I'll invite you into the conversation on that note. I know when we were putting together these stories and inviting people, to start envisioning what is your climate story, it unsurprisingly often started with someone's personal experience of an extreme weather event or disaster. And as we heard, it's very important, of course, to create space for people to process trauma and to come together around that. But it's not the only dimension that we want to stress in terms of what's possible when we talk about climate. And I think we were inspired to see that this sense of, an antidote to that is often action and sort of doubling down and engaging with your community. Can you talk a bit about how we saw that show up in the narratives from the Climate Story Project, and maybe even an example or two of what that looked like?
Absolutely. Throughout this process, it was really incredible to hear, as Shaina said, so many people started their stories with stories of disaster, but many people also couldn't help but reflect on their love of nature, on, the way nature looked when they were a child and the embrace of it, and something that they wanted to protect. Someone I'm thinking of specifically, I think is actually on the call with us. Brigitte is an incredible leader in her community and runs the Inner City Green Team. And I remember in her story, really, her love of nature inspiring sustained action for her community. That meant better recycling programs. She lives on a NYCHA campus, and so really working with her community at the NYCHA campus and across the city to promote healthier approaches to sustainability, to promote action, and even just awareness. As we said in the beginning, so much of this is about inviting people into the conversation and supporting and uplifting the fact that we all deserve to be a part of this conversation. And I think that is something that is so motivating and incredible to create action that not only is, the kind of motivation spurts that we can get when something exciting happens, but to create long-term engagement. And with this example specifically, Brigitte, took this nonprofit and created a network of people who are involved, who continue to engage with each other and engage with this issue across NYCHA campuses. And so, that's just an incredible example to me. And thank you so much, Brigitte, for being on the call. And I hope all of you will listen to her episode because she's a wonderful storyteller.
Fantastic. All right, Jamil, I want to bring you into the conversation, give you the last word, as it were. This framework that you introduced was really powerful, this sense of freedom, fairness, health, wealth, and security. Those are the ways in to talk about climate. If folks walk away from today's session with one action that they can take or thing they can consider in tweaking or improving the way that they're talking about climate in the work that they do, what might that be? Do you have a sort of quippy way to think about that, or an example that you saw that really embodies this?
Well, so first, thank you very much. So I didn't come up with the framework. We borrowed it from some very smart people. So just to clarify where it came from, and just to make sure I'm following the question, it's about if we were to use that framework as a bit of a guide for our own daily lives. Yeah, I think something that's happened, and I think that this in general, when you have these big societal issues, whether it's COVID, right, or climate, you first learn about it from and hopefully the source of truth, right, which is usually a little bit more scientific, a little bit more academic, a little bit wonkier, right? So whether you're looking at it from a health angle or a climate angle or a policy angle, hopefully your original source is somebody that has a lot of data and information, right? And I think usually to integrate that type of a framework in our daily lives, we kind of have to divorce ourselves from the source, right? Because we say, okay, I gotcha. I understand that this is an issue. But most of us don't wake up in the morning, I think, saying, I really hope I can do something today to start lowering the global temperature, right? Or, I really am worried today about what my impact is going to be on, air quality or water access, right? I think we should be thinking about these things. It's important, but most of us, I don't think, get out of bed in the morning or carry out our daily lives with these things as priorities, right? Because these are effectively like public goods, public services that bigger institutions are supposed to be providing for us, right? So I think we need, if we're going to really use that framework, to almost put climate aside for a second and say, like, well, what makes us human, right? Like, why, like, what's important to people on a daily basis? It's not usually climate, right? It's the impact that climate has on the things that we care about the most. And so not to go back to academia, but like Development is Freedom by Amartya Sen, right? Who won a Nobel Prize winning economist, was about we don't do economic and social development because we love GDP and to grow the wealth of a nation. We do it because there's basic freedoms that anybody in the world is going to need to exist. And so I think the more that we can think from that angle, less the climate angle, more the human angle, like what does the human care about, is probably the thing that's going to unite us the most, but also give us the most direction in terms of how we can shape and integrate this into our daily lives.
That's great. And it also ties back nicely to what you and Melissa both spoke about in terms of trusted messengers, right? It's like, who are you used to turning to for advice in your own life, whether it's a doctor or a loved one or faith leader or your mom? How do you empower those folks to be doing this work and to become trusted voices on issues like this, and doing that work to really translate what does climate look like in our lives every day, and how do we keep it front and center? We are just scratching the surface here, but I want to be respectful of the time that we booked for everyone today. And on behalf of the New York Climate Exchange, say thank you again for joining us. I think the enthusiasm we're seeing in the chat here is just reflective of the fact that people are energized in this moment, looking to maintain that momentum, looking to connect and push this work forward. And certainly the exchange wants to be a place and a dot connector to help make that happen, but also encourage folks to continue dropping links to the work that you're doing and seeking kind of peer-to-peer ways to keep the conversation going. And Helene, anything else we should shout out as we close things out?
I don't think so. Of course, follow us on social if you don't already to stay up to date on other events like this. And I really loved what you said, Melissa. People shift when their internal story changes. I feel like that's a great way to sum up really, what we're all trying to do and how we're trying to bring it down from that 10,000-foot level to like, the way we live every day. So I thought this was really helpful and I appreciate all of you joining.
Fantastic. Thanks again.
Thank you
Virtual
so
round of
much,
applause for
everybody.
everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Thank
Thank you.
you. Bye.